So these things that we've been taught as women, especially to think of as unspeakable, are often just really natural, normal aspects of being human. And the reason why we've been taught to stay silent about them is because they are for some reason inconvenient to our patriarchal culture.
Today's guest is Nicole Graev Lipson, an author, teacher, and mother whose work brings beautiful and raw honesty to the quiet complexities of family life. In her memoir, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, Nicole explores identity, rage, desire, and motherhood with a clarity that's both unflinching and deeply compassionate. She opens up about raising a gender non-conforming child, the emotional cost of telling the truth on the page, and how she reclaimed her creative voice after years of silence. We discuss how labels can both protect and imprison us, and how truth-telling can be the most generous thing a writer or parent can offer. This conversation isn't about having the answers, it's about daring to ask the real questions. Let's start the show. Nicole Graev Lipson, thank you so much for being on Scales of Success. I'm really excited to talk to you. Welcome.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're writing, and I will preface this because I tend not to read as much fiction as I want, and this is by no means fiction, but there's an artistry involved in your writing that is akin to fiction in that beyond the words, you're providing a lot of context for this brilliant mind working, which is super insightful. You talk about a lot of things that I want to dive into: identity, female identity, parents, teaching to some degree, which I'm sort of going to kick off. And I'm using sort of as an anchor, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, a memoir and essays. Congratulations on getting this published. I don't know what was entailed, which I would love to dive into as well, but I know it's no small feat.
Thank you.
And I want to kick it off by reading just one section here that caught my eye because it touches on a number of different themes. And I'm going to stop talking, but I want to just read this section here as we start. And I'm quoting here: "There are few greater joys when you're a teacher than discovering the key that unlocks what you've been trying to pry open. But in the final minutes of class the next day, as one student and then another reads their homework aloud, time slows and the desk tilts. And I understand without knowing how to stop it that everything is going wrong. The boys in the form of girls giggle and sway their hips and put on lip gloss. The girls in the form of boys play football and hit on chicks. Instead of dissolving stereotypes, what we're doing in this excruciating semicircle is reifying them." And for the context, you had set an assignment to sort of write about what it is from a male perspective and then a female perspective, so that there could be a greater sense of understanding. And the sense here is that it's sort of backfiring. You go on and you come across one particular student who says it was just too hard, he says, to write about this topic. He looks up at the ceiling, takes a breath. "Too hard," he goes on, "because I think about it every day of my life. All I want is for my brain to stop fucking thinking about it." And I want to go to that moment because this, while I haven't finished Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, this moment stuck out maybe as much as any other in the book, because there's a lot underneath it. And I want to just ask you, what are you thinking as I'm reading this? What was your state of mind? And I want to explore this a little bit more. I have several follow-on questions, but I want to kick it off there.
Sure. Thanks for reading that. It's always such an interesting experience to have somebody else read your words. Thank you. Yeah, so that excerpt comes from my essay, that As They Like It, where I'm reflecting on, I spent many years as a high school English teacher and reflecting on this moment when I had been teaching Shakespeare's play As You Like It to seniors for my senior English elective, and was really teaching this text from a feminist point of view and really trying to engage in it with my students through a feminist framework. So it was really thinking about, this play is one of Shakespeare's cross-dressing heroine plays, and Rosalind, the main character, has to flee from her uncle's oppressive court and flees to the forest of Arden dressed as a boy and cross-dressing as a boy. And so I was really trying to awaken my students to ideas about gender and gender stereotypes. And I had given them an assignment to go home that evening and write from the perspective of the opposite gender. So this was in 2009, right? When all of the great strides that have been made in thinking about gender had not been made yet. And this was an assignment that never in a million years would I give today, for all the reasons, that are quite obvious, but in the ways that we've been awakened to um, the greater nuances of gender. And so I thought this was a fantastic idea. I really thought that my students were going to go and like be awakened to all the ways that members of the opposite gender, might be constrained by gender expectations. And as you read, right, it didn't work out that way. They came in and they just basically validated and reinforced all the stereotypes in this assignment. And the student who spoke up was basically revealing to me in his own way as he was speaking that gender identity was something that he was internally struggling with. And then that becomes sort of the launching pad moment for the rest of that essay, which ends up being a real interrogation and investigation of what it means to parent a gender nonconforming child, which I have. So, I think that hearing that scene read aloud, I think a lot about how we as humans, have to respond to the situations that we're in as best we can, given whatever knowledge and experience we have at that given moment. And I was really interested in that essay and exploring that, how our understanding of certain things changes over time. Our culture changes over time simultaneously. Um, and trying to bring that phenomenon alive through personal experience and personal narrative writing.
Well, there's a couple of thoughts I want to explore. One is, and this is a heavier, broader question, but how do you think about identity, irrespective of gender? I mean, how do you view it through the lens of a teacher, as a writer, as a parent?
Such a good question. Um, I mean, I think that identity is very fluid. I mean, that's a term that we use very often when we're thinking about gender, but I do think it applies to so many different facets of identity. The opening essay of my book, Kate Chopin, My Mother and Me, I write about this affair that went on for several years, that my mother had while I was in high school, and ultimately how that led to the breakdown of my family of origin. And one of the things that I was really interested in exploring in that piece wasn't just female desire. That was definitely a big part of that essay. I was really interested in exploring female desire within the context of a long-term heterosexual marriage. But beyond that, what I was really interested in and exploring is how our feelings about certain incidents or experiences in our life can shift as our own identity changes. And so I was exploring in that piece how when I learned that my mother had an affair, I was an undergraduate college student immersed in my women's studies classes and sort of growing into my nascent feminism. And so the way that I thought about my mother's affair at that moment is very different than how I thought about it 10 years later when I married my husband and was sort of, sort of caught up in the romance of this new moment and fresh beginning, and thinking about my mother's actions as as a bride, and picturing all our happily ever after ahead of me, that identity changed the way I thought about my mom's actions. And then again, once I became a parent, I have three children, and once I became a parent, I again, my orientation to my mother's actions shifted with the shift into that identity as well. And suddenly, this sort of new anger awakened in me, and sense of betrayal as I started to think about, well, could I ever do that to my children? Um, and and then sort of come full circle at this point, and just having a deeper understanding and compassion for my mother, and where she was at her point in life back then. But this is all a really long-winded way, I think, of saying that you know obviously it's a much more prominent and obvious um, identity shift to change from the identity of a girl to the identity of a boy, which is what I've witnessed with my own child. Um, but all of us, I think, undergo these identity changes all the time that shift how we look at our own life, how we process our own life stories, and how we encounter the world.
It's so I appreciate that a lot. I think the fluidity of identity speaks to me in a number of capacities because I think on one hand, identity is a terrific mover forward, right? If you can identify something you want to be, some framing around what qualities you'd like to possess, which I sort of link on to as the most sustainable form of identity, sort of qualities you'd like to possess rather than form fitting into some sort of character. But I've also witnessed, if you become so affixed to a certain type of identity, it can really thwart your ability to grow. And in a lot of ways, I think those who are most capable, all growth requires some form of death, in my opinion. You need
Mm.
to bury. It's not about adding; it's more about removing some part of yourself, and that's not always an easy thing, particularly when it's coupled with memories or emotions of people who share that identity or who know that identity with you. But as it relates to um, you know looking at it through the lens of a child, and you do such a remarkable job of shifting perspectives sort of through different lineages. I mean, from your mom um, to your daughter, your son, Lay. So seeing all of these different play out is really interesting. And just to give some context on sort of what I'm thinking about while you're responding to me is, you're coming in as a young girl to see your mom after she had surgery on her nose. That was a really moving scene for me to witness as you're without judgment. And you do a terrific job of analyzing sort of the emotional state with the description of actually what's going on. But I don't sense a lot of judgment coming through that. I think there's an analysis of what's going on, which I think is really helpful for the reader to really process how all of this is playing out. But from that to fast forward, your daughter watching you put makeup on and sort of witnessing this idea of beauty. You even highlighted one of my most favorite scenes in the movie of uh,
Oh, Little Miss
Little
Sunshine.
Miss Sunshine, and it's also with my favorite, which is Alan Arkin. But you write, and I'm gonna state it. As her self awareness grows, so does her self doubt, and she looks to her grandfather, brilliantly played by Alan Arkin, for reassurance. Olive says, "Grandpa, am I pretty?" Grandpa says, "Olive, you are the most beautiful girl in the world." Olive says, "You're just saying that." Grandpa said, "No, I'm madly in love with you. It's not because of your brains or your personality. It's because you're beautiful inside and out." You go on to mention that it's not just that you can't just completely disqualify the outside. You have to include the inside as well. It's sort of the whole package. And I'm sort of meandering here, but I think I'm bringing it back to really witnessing a child identify whatever their identity is for that time frame, because it will evolve, right? I mean, as more of the world, as their perspective shapes, and there's a tremendous challenge in informing them on how to view view the world or process the world without projecting or infusing them with your own thoughts or hesitations. And I'm wondering if you can just explore that a little bit further with me as it relates uh, to your daughter Lay, who is non-gender specific as we have come to understand it. How did you first pursue that as a parent witnessing it, and how has that evolved to how you're viewing it now?
Um, so I often think of it as threading the tiniest needle. That's how I often think about it because I think that, none of us come into parenthood fully formed as parents, right? I mean, if only we had a baby and we were like, now I'm a parent, eureka, I know everything, I know what to do at every step and how to tackle every conflict. But unfortunately, the only way that we can become parents is in the parenting, right? And just trying things and making mistakes and learning from them, which is why I'm convinced I'm going to have to like beg forgiveness from my oldest child for the rest of my life because they're my they're my like experiment, and then the others I know better. um, but you know, I think as a parent, I often have to battle myself and curb myself from wanting to jump in, tell my children, this is how it is. This is how I see the world, and this is how you should see the world as well. Um, and really have tried over the years to become almost to see my role slightly differently than I did as a newer parent. My kids are now 15, 12, and 9. And I feel, and I don't do this all the time. I don't want to paint this portrait of myself always being able to do this, but at my best moments as a parent, I'm sort of a neutral witness to whatever it is that they're exploring and able to be there by their side as a mirror or a reflection back to them of what it is that I'm seeing without stepping in to change them. Obviously, if I think somebody's doing something dangerous or something, destructive, I will step in. But to be there as a neutral witness and to allow them to follow their own path, make their own mistakes, um, circle back, and change things if that's what they want to do. Um, but it's hard, it's sort of, I feel like it's a very thin path in a lot of ways, trying to do that, trying to prevent myself from jumping in and pointing them in the direction I want them to go in over and
Right.
over and over again.
Well, and I think a lot of the identity that we as adults tend to try and ascribe to others is really to help ourselves um, limit the unknowns and how we respond to that potential that prospective person. But it really does serves very little purpose if you start to know someone as they are, right?
Hmm.
So I do think of this. I think about some of, maybe as you alluded to, some of the friends who were seeing Lay, how you could tell that they didn't know whether to say how to how to address the situation, to bring it up, or whether or not to bring it up. And I sort of think, that's really just to provide comfort for them in a lot of ways, isn't it? It hasn't very little to do with that individual.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that because again, thinking about gender within the confines of my family's home. I mean, my children, no matter which one they are, which child it is, my youngest daughter or my son or my oldest, I'm not thinking about them through the lens of gender, first and foremost, right?
Right.
Within the walls of our home with the five of us, they're just, they're just us. They're just, and it's really only when we step out into the world, right, that these labels suddenly become important, right? Whether it's in the sort of the most literal way possible, right, which is like having to put a gender on a school application or something like this, just to, just moving through the world. And so it becomes really obvious in those public settings. Um, and, I think there is something that is very appealing about the comfort of labels, even for kids as they're trying to figure out who they are. Like, I think a lot of kids might take comfort in being like, I'm a soccer player, like I'm a dancer. My thing is that I'm musical, right? Because life is so amorphous and hard to rein in and unpredictable. And it does make things feel simpler to boil ourselves down, I think, to these labels and identities. And there are a lot of ways in which the world asks us to do that. I mean, none of my children are on social media, but, I can say that as a grown up, like that via social media. It's sort of like, what's your brand, right? Like, if I'm posting on social media as an author, like, do beach photos like fit into that? I'm not sure. Like we're all
Yeah, yeah.
sort of like thinking about ourselves in these kind of larger within this larger framework of identity and labels and reducing ourselves in a lot of ways. Um, and I think it's, yeah, as you say, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? It's can be liberating or comforting, but it can also be very limiting.
What do you think? And I'll move off from this topic because I think this is a relevant conversation. I think in today's world, I think increasingly so. But also, I think there's a lot of landmines where even people who are interested in exploring this further don't really know how to approach this subject even further, which in some ways seems a little absurd given how much information is out there. But still, in real life conversations, I think it's difficult to broach. And on that topic, what do you think those who have more rigid assumptions about identity, maybe that you've encountered within your own circle, however it may be? I'm thinking of certain listeners within this audience group who are both on one hand very very accepting of this conversation, and on the other some may be uncomfortable about it.
Mhm.
What do you think is the misconception for those who are more uncomfortable? What do you think is being missed in um, resisting this more broad acceptance toward understanding identity?
Um, are you referring specifically to gender identity
I think that's
for the
the
most
main
part?
one, but I think it extends further. But let's focus on that one.
Yeah. So I think that actually one of the worst things that has happened around cultural conversations of gender identity, particularly when it comes to gender and youth, is that the conversation has been hijacked by extreme ends of the political spectrum on both ends. So, on the far right, the sort of like total lack of tolerance, and then a parent spokesperson for that side of things could be, I'm forgetting his name, but the father in Texas whose son who's divorced, and his son declared, that he was a girl, and became a whole legal battle with his ex-wife, and then on the far left, the sort of zero tolerance for any questioning whatsoever of like what might bring teenagers beyond gender dysphoria to be exploring gender identity and trying on different genders. And I think what both sides have managed to do is silence the vast, 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 vast middle, which includes all of us who might, on the one hand, believe in humans' right to live their own lives with dignity and to make their own choices, but on the other hand, might have questions about how, sort of how fast everything has moved in this arena over the past few years, might have questions about some of the medical interventions, that have been largely adopted over the past few years. And so I think that all of us would be better served if we didn't feel so silenced by these like barbelled ends of the spectrum, because I think most people can find common ground around these issues, and none of us know the answer. Some people think they do, but none of us know the answer.
Well, and I appreciate that quite a bit because the one thing that I always focus on is I sometimes have conversations with people who have very strong opinions about um, controversial topics, but they really don't have any relationships with anyone who's at the center of those controversial topics.
Mhm.
And I think framing it through the lens of your own child, it's a very different thing because almost anyone can relate to someone they know, someone they love, someone that they are unconditionally supportive of. And I think it becomes a very different conversation. So anyway, I appreciate that feedback. I don't want to keep you in this state. I want to ask some other questions because you had mentioned before that becoming a mother forced your creative self underground for a while, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about as a creative person who has been writing for all of her life. How did motherhood change that writing process? What does it look like now? How are you using it differently, if at all? I'm just curious how that's evolved.
Yeah, I love this question. And I have lots to say about it. But yeah, as I write about in my book, writing is one of the through lines of my life, from starting in second grade, I sort of like fell in love with creative writing and pursued it, in many different ways through college and after, and have spent years of my adult life as a freelance writer, in addition to teaching high school English. And when I had my first child, I really felt in the months and really going into years um, after she was born that I think I describe it in the book as a vein being cauterized. Like it wasn't just like, oh, I don't have enough time, or I'm so busy. It was really that I felt like, how did I do that before? Who was that person? And I've had a lot of time to reflect on this at this point. And I've realized that what cut me off from my creative self during those years, first couple of years of my child's life, um, wasn't being a mother. It was trying to mother and be a mother in this sort of way that I saw the mythic mother with a capital M in our culture, the sort of idealized, sort of self sacrificing, eternally patient, calm, devoted mother. And I spent a lot of those first couple of years moving through the world feeling that I was at once myself and not myself. That I was me, Nicole, who I'd always been, but that I'd also sort of stepped into this fictional character of mother with a capital M. And it was that was keeping me feeling divorced from my writing self. It was sort of white knuckling my way every day through this persona and feeling like I had to meet this standard. And ultimately, the irony is that what got me back to the page and what ended up creating this book, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, was also motherhood. But it was a few years later, once I'd sort of um, recovered from those initial couple of years, become a little bit more experienced as a mother, a little bit more seasoned, more comfortable, more competent. Um, I had something happen to me that was really extraordinary, and I I don't think it will. It never has. Nothing like this had happened to me before, and I'm pretty certain nothing like this will happen to me again. Which is that it was literally almost like a single moment where it was when my youngest child turned 2, and I was overcome with this almost bodily feeling of resolve and determination. Like, it wasn't, oh, I want to start trying to get back to my writing. It was like I was suddenly possessed, and I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to center writing in my life, and I am going to work now toward my dream of being a writer in the way that I've always wanted to be a writer, even before I had children. And it was like I knew that I was going to do it, not that I was going to try to do it. It was like, come hell or high water, this is going to happen. And I've thought a lot about why that happened to me. Why I had this almost like sudden possession. And it was motherhood. It was motherhood that did that to me. So motherhood, on the one hand, pulled me from my creative self, but it was also motherhood that filled me with this intense resolve to become the writer, the sort of writer that I'd always wanted to be.
But what about motherhood do you think drove you? What was that lightning bolt that at that moment? Because that was your third child that turned 2, correct?
Yeah.
So you had some motherhood under your belt at that point.
Yeah. So my oldest was, yeah, 5. No, 6, 7. Yeah, no, sorry, I'm thinking when she was born. Yeah, I had some motherhood under my belt. Um, I think it was a couple of things. I think, first of all, that nothing has brought me in closer touch or more aware of mortality than motherhood, than having children. And, I think that there's something about parenting that awakens you to life's fragility and the fleeting nature of time. And so I think that I just had this feeling of like, it is up to me to live my life as my heart most yearns to live it. No one else is going to hand this to me. And the time is now. I just had that sort of like feeling of, time's winged chariot at my back in a way that I didn't when I was younger, right? Because we think we have all the time in the world when we're younger to achieve our dreams. And then the second aspect of motherhood that I think was so motivating was motherhood didn't change in any fundamental way what I care about most as a person. I've always been really, since high school or college, I've always been very aware of my own womanhood, and my lens as of womanhood is just a really central lens in how I see the world. I went to an all-girls school for 13 years growing up, and I think that was really formative in my own identity. And so I've always, really cared about um, issues pertinent to women. I've always looked through the world in a somewhat feminist lens. Um, but it was one thing for instance, it's one thing for our culture's impossible beauty standards to turn me against my own body as a woman, right? Like, that was terrible. When I went through a period of disordered eating, in college and a little beyond. That was terrible. but okay, right? It's me, right? I get over it and move on, and I can, sort of critique the culture that gave rise to that. But once I had daughters, like looking at their own perfect bodies, perfect infant female bodies and toddler female bodies, the thought of them one day being taught to turn against themselves or taught to hate their own bodies filled me with such intense rage, um, and was very activating in the sense that I knew that these were also the sorts of things that I wanted to write about. So not only did I want to like center writing and become the writer that I had always longed to be, but I had this very clear raison d'etre for for putting pen to paper, metaphorically, right? Like I wanted to write about these things. And having a son too, because I write about the templates and boxes that boys and men are put into our culture as well. These things are like interlocking pieces of a puzzle, right? It's not just women who have to contend with, all these expectations. Wanting to write about these issues on behalf of my son as well. So I found motherhood to be a really galvanizing force in that way, a galvanizing creative force. And I think I said to someone recently, I was like, parental indignation is a really strong creative motivator. I found
Mm-hmm.
that it was.
Sure.
I wanted to fight for my kids and for other children.
Well, I think having kids too actually has helped me in a lot of ways look at people as children to some degree,
Oh
that
yeah.
they are we're all dealt a deck of cards that or a hand that we may not be equipped to play.
Mm.
And I always think of a high school basketball coach who once told me, it's normally the worst basketball players that become good coaches because they have to break down the fundamentals and be technical. And in a lot of ways, as a parent, it's very quick where you realize I've been dealing with a lot of these issues, and my son's 2.5 now, which is he's at the peak of you know where his frustration is his highest, and his ability to deal with that frustration could not be
I
lower,
know.
proportionate to his increasing feelings and sensations. And I go through this process where I'm realizing that I need to learn how to teach that. And just because I was facilitating uh, these challenges on my own doesn't mean I ever knew really how to do this. And so seeing it through a child's eyes, I wonder if you are have come to some similar parallel where it's akin to I'm having to break myself down to some degree and build myself back up more closely aligned to who I've always maybe been.
I love the way you put that. Well, I do think that there is something about being a parent that, for me personally, that makes me want to inspire, makes me want to, or makes me aspire to have as much integrity as I can. I
Sure.
mean, I think first of all, kids sniff out instinctually any hypocrisy or lack of integrity in their parents. It's like they're built for it. They just have a radar, which is why, I mean, most basic example, I forbid my kids from getting social media, but of course, for my own work, I am on social media quite a bit. So they love calling that out, right? Like,
Right.
oh, mom, social media is so terrible. Then why are you sitting there on Instagram? And they're right to some extent, but um, you know, so it doesn't feel good when your kids call out your hypocrisy. And even if they don't call it out, when we are giving our children advice or trying to help them be their best selves, we know internally if we're not living our lives by those same principles or according to that same wisdom. Um, And I think parenting asks us in many ways to be philosophers,
Very much so.
to to shape our own philosophies that we want to impart to our children. You know, it it forces us to crystallize thoughts that might be partially formed in our minds about our own ethics and our own moral code and how we believe are the right ways to live, right? And so it calls us to task as well in practicing what we preach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your writing process now like? I mean, is it a daily thing? How do you approach it?
I've never been one of those writers who's like, okay, every morning from, 9 to 1, I sit down and write, or, occasionally when I'm on a deadline, I will give myself a certain word count, you know, um, goals. But I think of myself a little bit as a binge writer.
Hmm.
Um, I often, if I'm in the middle of a project, in the middle of an essay, for instance, I become like pretty swept up in it and will try to fit in writing literally wherever I can. I'll neglect other tasks. I'll look up at my clock from my computer and be like, "Oh my goodness, it's 5 minutes till I have to pick my kids up at school," and
Right, right.
like throw on sneakers and my pajamas and stumble out of the house like a weirdo. Um, so that can go on, for a while when I'm in the middle of a project. And then I sort of come back to the real world when it's done and, pay my bills and do the things that I need to do that I've been neglecting. And then when I'm back in a writing project again, I'll lose myself and,
Yeah.
yeah, forget to shower. So
You journal?
I wouldn't. I keep a notebook. I keep a notebook. It's mostly to like write down little snatches of things, that lines that come to me, or especially when I'm in the middle of a writing project. Just little ideas or something that I want to remember. Um, and I often, it's partly like a commonplace book, like where I write down quotes from things I'm reading that I want to keep track of as well. So it's like a little bit of a reading log, in some ways, but it's not like a diary or regular journaling practice per se.
What's your reading practice?
I always have a book that I'm in the middle of, and I try my best. It doesn't always work depending what's going on with my kids, but I really try my best to read for like an hour every night before I go to sleep. Of course, that's always the time when like my oldest will have been avoiding me and writing me off like all day long, and then will like show up by my bedside just being like, "Hey, like, so have you ever thought about how weird it is that like ducks just, and I'm like, oh gosh, and I have to force myself to put the book down. Um, but I love reading. It is my happy place to be in a book. And I pretty much read exclusively just hard copy books. I haven't gotten into the Kindle or e-readers at all. And yeah, that's my like window in the evening.
Is it fiction that you're primarily reading? Are you reading poetry? Like what's your diet?
I think the largest majority of my reading is nonfiction, memoir, but literary nonfiction. So memoir, essay collections, but also fiction as well. Um, but I do love imaginative nonfiction.
Well, in your book, I mean, these essays are highly personal, and I'm curious, how do you reconcile? Um, I mean, I think to a large degree, these themes, these points get lost if they're not honest
Mhm.
and brutally honest at that,
Yeah.
on that note. How do you approach? I mean, because you've talked about, your mother's infidelity. You've talked about when you were taking a creative writing class later in your life, moments of passion that can potentially take over. How do you reconcile that? Is that something you do you have any? I'm putting myself in your shoes, and I wonder, Man, I don't know if I want to put this on paper, but there's something really powerful about it. There's nothing, if going back to identity, if this is you, there's no apologies necessary for you,
Mm.
but I'm just curious do you have any, do you want to comment on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I could produce a dissertation for you actually, if you, if you had
I'm
time.
very curious
I've
about this
given
because
this
there's
so
a lot
much
of
thought.
personal stuff.
Yeah. Well, I knew from the beginning, once I realized that I was writing a book, because I didn't know at first that I was writing a book. The first a few of these essays were originally published as standalone pieces in literary journals. But what drew me to the page when I was writing was this desire to crack through the ready-made stories, the sort of surface stories that we tell about ourselves, right? And sort of to use myself as a case study in this endeavor. And so to not write truthfully about myself would be to jeopardize the entire endeavor. I mean, the whole point was to, again, brush away these fictional lives that we lead somewhat unwittingly, And so I really did want to drill down to the deepest truths underlying some of my surface experiences. So I knew I needed to do that, but I also really wanted to do that. And the reason why I really wanted to do that is that I think that moving through the world in ways that are not honest, that are not truthful, takes a psychic toll.
Hmm.
And all of us, I think, live our lives in to some degrees, right? We absorb fictions, whether we're man, woman, anything in between. Um, but I think for women, there is a larger psychic toll in some ways, broadly speaking, just because there are so many ways that we are kind of pushed or encouraged to reduce ourselves, to erase our own complexities, to step into these templates that were offered. And so, in some ways, I wanted to tell the truth and be honest because I felt really burdened by carrying on this sort of charade in front of myself, if that makes sense. Um, and I've given this a lot of thought because if I were to imagine the places in the book that people would be like, "Oh wow, like she's going there," like I know what places those would be, right? Like you mentioned one of them, right? So, you know, talking in one of the essays really openly about this kind of sudden and overwhelming attraction I had to this younger man in a poetry class in the midstream of an otherwise happy, healthy, long-term marriage. I would imagine another place in the book that would raise those kinds of eyebrows is when I like admit to wanting to flee from my children. Like, not forever, but
Yeah.
these got very strong urges to escape from my family into solitude. Um, and the thing about examples like this is that on the surface they might seem like really taboo or sort of shocking. But if you think about it, I think we'd be hard pressed to find anyone in a long term marriage who has not at some point found themselves attracted to somebody else. I know for a fact this isn't like scientific research, but pretty much every single woman I'm friends with who has children, like, has talked to me about wanting to flee from them from time to time. So these things that we've been taught as women, especially to think of as unspeakable, are often just really natural, normal aspects of being human. And the reason why we've been taught to stay silent about them is because they are, for some reason, inconvenient to our patriarchal culture. And the mechanism by which we are kept silent is shame, right? I think women would be very ashamed to admit that they want to flee their family sometimes. That's not something we're supposed to feel, right? And so I sort of started to see speaking these truths as, listen, like I'm not standing, I'm not walking down the Washington Mall with like a protest sign, but I felt like it was like my own form of activism and saying, these things are not unspeakable. They're actually really normal, and I'm going to speak them. um, and I'm glad I did.
Was there any trepidation about getting this out? Were you nervous about this being published and being seen by the broader world, or by some of the subjects who were included? Did they get to see it beforehand? I'm just curious about how the sausage is made a little bit.
Totally. Much more concerned about the actual people in my life than the
Sure.
broader world. Yeah. And, I sort of, a few things. Like I had a few guardrails in place. One being, things from craft elements that I had in place to kind of like interpersonal approaches. But from a writing craft lens, I was always really careful when I was writing that I was only writing from my own embodied experience. What I, Nicole, could see, touch, taste, hear, smell with my own senses. And while I felt it was okay for me to imagine my way into what, my daughter might be thinking or feeling, or my husband, it was not my place to claim that I knew what they might be thinking or feeling in any given moment, right? I'm just presenting my side of the door. Um, but beyond that, I think I always was really cognizant too that I was writing with kindness. Um, and when I think about kindness as a nonfiction writer, as a memoirist, I distinguish it from niceness. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. I'm not trying to present anyone through rose-colored lenses all the time, but I'm trying to have real regard and respect of who the people in my life are, and seeing them with wholeness and respect, and also turning that same lens on myself simultaneously. Um, and then interpersonally, if there was anything that I was worried about, anything that as I was writing it, gave me pause, I always talked about it with the person at hand. And one thing I will say is that I didn't broach these topics with my loved ones in the sense of like, here, I'm writing about this, read it, and let me know if I have your blessing. I think as memoirists, we talk a lot about permission, right? Like, do we have somebody's blessing? Do we have someone's permission? I ended up finding it a lot more meaningful to talk with my loved ones about the thing itself first, as opposed to the fact that I was yearning to write about the
Sure.
thing. Does that make sense?
It does.
And so I was really honest with my loved ones, about what I might have been grappling with. And then those conversations, 9 times out of 10, were really nourishing conversations that brought us closer together, because they were honest conversations that I probably would have been intimidated to broach if I didn't have this sort of external motivation. Um, and and so I feel really lucky in that way. But I do want to say, and this is a thought that recently occurred to me, but I think it's a really important thought. I'm very hesitant and reluctant to kind of give any concrete advice to other memoirists, other writers about how to do this, because one of the reasons that I was able to write so honestly about my experiences is because I for instance, am in a marriage that can tolerate some complexity. And many people are not. And I wouldn't have written about this if I had thought that doing so would blow up my life in some horrible way. I knew it wouldn't, and so I just want to say that to point out those circumstances. And I feel really grateful to have those circumstances, but it's not safe for everyone to just walk around speaking their truths.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you feel a lightness after having published this, that, that this is out there, so to speak, that this truth of yours is now in perpetuity, among your legacy presented to the world?
I do in some ways. I mean, I'm not a celebrity, right? It's not that I feel like I personally, Nicole, owe the world my truth in any way. Um, but I do find a great deal of joy and pleasure in hearing from readers who connect with my book, who have felt a lightening in their own lives by seeing some of their experiences reflected or validated in these ways. Um, and as much as it brings me joy that they feel unburdened, as I said, like I wrote this as an unburdening as well. And there's this sort of just great pleasure in these connections and finding community through the telling of truths, and thinking that by putting myself out there, maybe I'm inspiring, other readers to do so a little bit in their own lives as well, in whatever shape, that takes in their own lives, whether they're writers or not. And I will say that, you know, maybe even more than feeling like, oh, I've put this out there, that feels like an unburdening. I feel like I am much more able to move through the world in honest ways having written this book, because to be honest and to realize, like, it's okay, like nothing horrible happened, gives you confidence to continue to do that, and to be like, okay, I can. And it's funny because I find myself sometimes now just like saying stuff like almost a little impulsively, like in social situations, because I'm a little bit less filtered,
Yeah,
and being like, oh, maybe I'm going too far with this honesty thing, it's
I can
like,
see this. I can see how
it's
that happens. I can definitely see how that happens. I'm curious. So we're coming up on time, but I want to ask one last question before we close. Where do you see, as someone who came through an all female school, who's had a feminist perspective, where do you see feminism, which I actually don't hear that word all that often quite as much anymore? Where do you see that going into the future, especially now in 2025, where, I mean, we saw some pretty staggering consequences from Me Too. I think you've alluded to sort of the polarity in how some of those consequences are being interpreted by our political system. But I don't even want to talk about politics, really. It's really about the human side of this that is most interesting to me. Where do you see feminism going?
Well, we're witnessing a really frightening moment in the US right now, and a real, um, sort of pushing of reductive archetypes more than ever. Um, and I follow the news and the sort of pro-natalist movement and all these ways, right, that women are being pushed towards, really outdated modes of womanhood and motherhood. So, I think we have a lot of work to do. But and it's one of the reasons why I was really happy to do this podcast and really happy to be talking with you as a man, is I just think that so much of our dialogues, whether it's about, feminism or any other issues, happen in echo chambers these days. And I I've been thinking so much about, books like Mothers and Other Fictional Characters, books that might be branded, for instance, as like motherhood books, how they have so much to say to men as well, and I don't just mean my book alone. My book has come out with a wave of really interesting um, books that come at the experience of motherhood and womanhood from different angles. And I've often thought to myself what a disservice really the publishing industry does by kind of siloing and marketing these books so much to women, and how wonderful it would be if the sort of art that people are exposed to was just broader, right? That like the conversations that they were tapped into were broader. I'm sure that there are many interesting, important conversations that I myself am not privy to because I'm a woman. And I would just love to see some of that siloing break down. I'm actually, maybe you can help me with this. I had this whole idea because a friend of mine sent me a photo of her husband reading Mothers and Other Fictional Characters in bed. And she's like, he can't put it down, you know? And, um, and then that's happened a few times, right? Like people are like, oh, like I'm making, my husband read it and like he's really loving it. And I think it's so wonderful, right, that women readers would want to share this with their male partners. And I just think, I was thinking, I was like, I want to collect these photos of men reading Mothers and Other Fictional Characters. And I think I'm going to start an Instagram series, The Men of Mothers and Other Fictional Characters. And just try to normalize that, like, you can read books that aren't marketed to you explicitly, right? And that there's nothing shameful about being a man reading about motherhood. And that seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many comments I've had that were like, "Oh, yeah, I bought this for my wife," and I'm like,
Right,
and I've
right, right.
said, and I've said, Mothers and Other Fictional Characters is for everyone. You should
It
give it a
is.
try too.
Well, you're sort of taking some of the words out of my mouth because I will say I don't think I'm your targeted demographic, although I should not be excluded from it. And I have read a lot of things out of obligation, including starting to do this one, and I could not put it down. I'm about three quarters done, but I think it's beautifully written. I think it is a challenge to all of our brains, our emotional uh, muscle, so to speak, because I think there's a lot of subject matter and there's juicy subject matter. There's also really challenging subject matter, but I found it to be very thought provoking, really thorough, very honest. And I think it does a terrific job of, I loved how you've included everything from metamorphosis to Shakespeare, countless other references that I'm finding. I'm happy to go back. Crime and Punishment. I'm pulling out some of these references. It's like, wow, man, I haven't read a lot of that in a while, and it's also a good on ramp to pulling some of those books and dusting them off. But thank you so much for being on. Is there anything, any closing thoughts or any questions you think I might have missed that you'd like to address?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of great territory. And thank you so much for having me on and for your kind words about the book. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Thanks for listening. For a detailed list of episodes and show notes, visit scalesofsuccesspodcast.com. If you found this conversation engaging, consider signing up for our newsletter, where we go even deeper on a weekly basis, sharing exclusive insights and actionable strategies that can help you in your own journey.
We'd also appreciate if you subscribed, rated, or shared today's episode. It helps us to attract more illuminating guests, adding to the list of enlightening conversations we've had with New York Times bestsellers, producers, founders, CEOs, congressmen, and other independent thinkers who are challenging the status quo. You can also follow us for updates, extra content, and more insights from our guests. We hope to have you back again next week for another episode of Scales of Success. Scales of Success is an Edge West Capital production.